his coffee and spirits himself to a side table. On behalf of Ryerson University, I'm delighted to welcome you to another in the series of QUESTtalks at Ryerson. My name is Sean Conway. I am currently a visiting fellow at the Ryerson Center for Urban Energy, and I see a number of faces here who have been very active and positive partners in the work we do at the center, but I really am pleased to be here today. My colleague Dan McGilvery, who many of you may know, would like to be here today, but Dan's mother passed away this past few days, so he's at a funeral this morning, but asked me to send his regrets and his regards. Let me get the thank you to the Canadian Gas Association, our sponsor for today. I don't know whether we got anybody from CGA here, but Richard, you make sure that our friends at CGA know that we very much appreciate their ongoing support for the good work that Quest does in bringing people together to talk about a subject today that, needless to say, given the winter we've had, the year we've had, the world in which we now live, resilience, smart energy communities in the age of extreme weather. That's what we're here to talk about this morning. We're going to have really about a two-part program. We've got an excellent key guest presenter, whom I will introduce momentarily. And after Alec does his presentation, we will have a panel. And the panel is intended to be interactive, so you'll have an opportunity as an audience to engage this important debate. I've been reminded to tell you that this session is going to be recorded both visually and in audio terms. Have I got that right? I don't see oh yes, there they are. It's sort of like those call centers, you know, when you call Bell or Rogers and you're in a really good mood, and as you kind of calm your jets, somebody says, just before you begin the conversation, we want you to know that this conversation for something quality or something will be recorded. So I just wanted to let you know that there is going to be a recording, both visual and audio, of this session today. Well, let me just make a couple of introductory remarks before I introduce and call upon our guest speaker. I was thinking as I prepared some brief remarks for this morning that it was 16 years ago this winter, a much, much more benign winter when I think about it, that in a previous life, some of you may know, I was a member of the legislature. My electoral district was right on the Ontario-Quebec border. And this was, of course, the winter of 1998. And as I like to say to my students, I'm a boomer. And that makes me one of God's chosen people. And, you know, that indispensable, irreplaceable cohort that I keep saying to the millennials, that it's going to be their great privilege to shoulder into an endless eternity. But as a boomer, you know, I've had life pretty good in terms of basic and essential services. The idea, for example, that electricity wouldn't be available for 2 weeks in a Canadian winter is not something even my ancient grandfather would have talked about. But there it was. It was one of the most memorable and insidious experiences of my life, because I had I think at one point, about 25,000 of my constituents, and I was one of them for a number of days, with no power. And unlike the Toronto situation just before Christmas, it didn't get to minus 20 degrees Celsius. The temperature remained in around -2 or -3, as I recall. It never got that cold, but I remember we were all very worried about what would happen if, in fact, the temperature did, as it often does in January, just drops off the cliff. I remember getting on the phone, because I lived in a place called Pembroke, and I remember phoning my father, and I said, well, my house doesn't work. And he said, right, how much education have you got? But I said, well, what am I going to do? He said, well, you better start praying, because till this electricity comes back, you've got a house in which nothing works. And I thought, well, this can't be. And in fact, it was the case. And then I would go out with the OPP and others to see people in particularly the rural hinterland. And if you remember that, I'm telling you, it was an experience that radicalized me, I'll tell you, and particularly if you're in public office. Because I just remember day in and day out, going out to meet, farmers with 3 little kids and 60 Holsteins that had to be milked, or a nursing home operator or a hospital administrator with, well, exactly, who was their charge. And I thought to myself, can you imagine going to the press conference if this were a failure of public administration or public policy? It was pretty clear why what had happened was happening. It was absolutely stunning to watch it happen, but there it was. And I remember coming out of that experience thinking, resilience, and that is, if I've got one complaint, and I want to say to our guest speaker, these engineers, and we've got a very distinguished member of the engineering community about to speak to us, engineers and policymakers generally, they love phrases like resilience and redundancy. And they're very good words for an audience like this. The problem I found and still find with the rank and file, of Main Street, those words convey absolutely no meaning. And in fact, one of the, we're having a debate over at the legislature that's been going on now for a year, and it's a good debate. It's a debate we ought to have. It has to do with what, if anything, do we need to do about strengthening certain capacities for energy delivery in the Southwest GTA. It's been going on, actually, for a number of years, and it's a good debate to have. We seem to be struggling to actually get to the core of the issue. On the 8th of July, there was a torrential downpour, the heart of Canada. Do you remember that rainstorm on Monday night? I think it was Monday night, July the 8th. And in fact, a number of things happened that night that actually connect back to this question of resilience and redundancy. Not at all clear to me that any of the folks charged with at least one undertaking have made that connection yet. And one of the things I hope we can do, well, I see a few people looking quizzically. I tell you, I pay very close attention, and I hope I am wrong. Because I recall that radical experience, day in, day out, going out to people on day 12, no electricity. We don't know when it's coming back for you, but it's probably sooner than later. And going out, watching people in Toronto, and the circumstance, one of the things about the pre-Christmas or the Christmas New Year's experience is it's a reminder, too, that sometimes the worst of it will happen when you least expect it or can not least able to deal with it. If you look at what happened to us on December 21st, if you were picking particularly, if you set out with malice aforethought to pick a bad time, that you would be hard-pressed, actually, to find a better time, better meaning the worst time, than a Saturday night going into a 2-week slowdown of the economic and social life, well, that's the social life of the community, actually, that's not correct, but you know the point I'm getting at with Christmas, New Year's. Boy, I just try to find an electrician on the Sunday, on December 22nd, particularly with kids and other circumstances at home where they're wondering what is going to happen to get some heat into this. So with those kinds of issues before us, this talk today I think is particularly timely. And it's my distinct pleasure today to introduce our guest speaker for this morning, Alec Hay, who will be well known to many of you. Alec comes to us from a very wide-ranging and an important experience in the British Army. He's been to Bosnia and Belize and Iraq and Northern Ireland and Afghanistan. So this is a man who, by virtue of that experience, knows something about the challenge of adversity and providing infrastructure in very difficult circumstances. He currently is the resilience and security planning leader at DIALOG. He is also an adjunct professor at the University of Toronto. He is a civil engineer who is licensed to practice that important profession in most of Canada. And without further ado, would you please welcome our guest speaker this morning, Alec Hay. Alec?
Thank you very much. I'm just going to switch these over briefly. I think I'll just start by saying that resilience as a label is relatively new. It comes from ecology and were featured in a paper by Holling in '73. And there he was talking about how in nature those things that essentially can adapt to changes will prove resilient. But resilience itself is not new. The principles of resilience were applied when Cyrus the Great laid out the Persian Empire. So to say this is a new idea would be a little false. 3,000 years of heritage that we know of is a pretty good leader. But when you think about what does it actually mean? And I think one of the best illustrations was, whilst I was in Bosnia, I came across this bakery. The bakery had been built just outside Bihać in a valley which had the sweetest spring water, and that's why the bakery was there. But it was also subject to flash flooding at very, very short notice. So the very simple solution that they came up with was we'll put the ovens up a floor, and we'll put the flour a floor above that. It meant that when a flash flood came, at the very worst, they would lose 1 day of production. But they would never be out of production. They were never adversely affected by something that would wipe out a business under normal circumstances. And really, that gets down to the core of what resilience is about. So for our purposes, this is the question I will try and answer for you. And I'll present a few ideas about it. I have a very simple format for what I'm going to talk about. A very simple why, what, and how. So without worrying about it too much, let's look at why. Flooding is something of an issue for us. In fact, it is the #1 insurance risk globally. Flooding is becoming more prevalent, particularly with the temperature rises that we're experiencing at the moment. We have far greater moisture in the air, and this is coming down in far denser precipitation. Now, the point is that it's not that it's going to be a narrower deluge or anything like that. No, it's actually just more precipitation, but in more concentrated flow. Now, the issue that comes with that is that most of it comes off as surface runoff, and it is something that our infrastructure has not been built to deal with. These statistics, by the way, come from the Canadian Disaster Database. Wildfire. It's a similar trend. And, of course, tornadoes. In 1 year, Southwest Ontario had 18. Now, conventional wisdom says that tornadoes don't come into the city, and waterspouts certainly don't become tornadoes. The residents of Vaughan will argue with the first one, and the farmers in Prince Edward County would argue with the second one. Conventional wisdom hasn't really got much sway here anymore. But it's not just the natural environment that's doing this to us. Now, this particular picture is taken from the Madrid train bombing. Ironically enough, it could have very easily happened here, and almost did. It was literally just hours away. We also like rioting in this country, particularly after a Stanley Cup that doesn't go the right way. But there are quite a few public disorder events, and this affects downtown cores at any scale of community. And how that community deals with it will depend very much on its access to utilities. There's also the accidental events, propane gas explosions, North Toronto, and the lights. And the consequences of all of this are compounded by two other features. The first one is we are tending towards a higher concentration of value. So, for example, if you look at a data center, the way technology has moved us into data centers, the value transmitted through that data center is greater than it has ever been before. That applies to cities as well. The consequences of flooding are far greater today than they ever were. The consequences of power outage, far greater today than they ever were. And it continues. The other influence is the take-up of technology. We are taking up technology, and we have to remain competitive, but we're taking it up faster now than we are able to recognize and identify the vulnerabilities inherent in that technology. And SCADA is a classic example. To maintain all those updates, we have not had the time to scrutinize where all the back doors are, the trap doors and things like that, and we've just absorbed it. And whilst we're still working out where the vulnerabilities are, we're bringing in the next round of technology. And that's accelerating. So we have layers of compounded vulnerability that we have yet to discover. UNISDR published last year, at the end of last year, a very, very clear statement. And actually, this reflects, if you go back to Richardson or you go back to Peter Drucker or anyone like that, who, to paraphrase, very simply said, the first duty of business, a corporation, a community, whatever, is not the maximization of profit, it is the protection against loss. And if you can't protect yourself against loss, you will never make money, you will never sustain yourself, you will never develop. So let's look at what resilience is in itself. Here's the definition we're using at U of T. It's a very simple definition for operational resilience. The emphasis there is on the word recover. A lot of people have adopted the DHS definition, although that has recently been changed by White House edict, but not practically within the DHS, which was talking about infrastructure hardening. It was talking about robustness. And in fact, the definition of robustness had been used under the word resilience. Resilience is about your ability to continue operations. It is about your ability to self-recover even after a catastrophic event. And when you talk about recovery, that certainly implies a certain degree of failure. You're recognizing that you will fail, something will fail. The question is, what do you do about it to survive? Let's imagine for a moment you decide to live on Ellesmere Island. It's actually a gorgeous place. But Ellesmere Island, 80 degrees north, one day, one night, you're up there for your year with your family, and your house burns down. It's been built to code, so you evacuate your family safely within a half hour. Now what do? You freeze to death. Because actually the function, the purpose of that house was not to be a home or to be something physical that you protect. The purpose of that home was to provide shelter for the family. And it is that purpose that continues. It doesn't go away if you've got a catastrophe. So the emphasis has to be on that operation. What is the purpose that you are building things for? We build infrastructure for a purpose. We don't do it because it just makes us feel good or to waste public money. We build infrastructure to deliver a purpose. That purpose needs to continue, and that's what we need to focus on protecting. That is the essence of sustainable development. So let's look at the sequence of an incident. We're going along, happy as Larry, at this level of performance in normal routine, and catastrophe hits. Our performance, whether it's operational, financial, or irrespective, just using a general term, our performance will go down to zero or very nearly zero. And a lot of that has to do with the shock. It's a human reaction. We don't know what's going on, so we stop. We try and understand what is going on. But we need to be able to react. And we need to be able to react very quickly. And the way we react, we have not yet had an opportunity to understand our environment at all. We have not had an opportunity to understand what the situation is. So we need to have some pre-prepared reaction measures that we can put into place immediately. And what this does, it brings us up to a basic survivable level. It's not sustainable, but we're not going to die. Our business is not going to fail. Patients are not going to die in the hospital because of a power outage. We then have a deliberate phase. And this is where the emphasis is on decision-making. It's on awareness of what is happening and making decisions that will allocate resources according to the situation. So the first one is visceral. This is very much a deliberate decision-making process. And we need to inform that. That brings us up to a minimum sustainable level of performance. In other words, we can continue at this level of performance. We're not going to make any money. We're not going to achieve anything, but we can continue at this level. And we then go into the recovery phase. And the recovery phase is a predefined sequence of events, of activities, of actions that we will take to bring us back up to at least our prior level of performance. And ideally, we'll be going to a higher level of performance. So if the recovery is deliberate, predetermined sequence, and the reaction is predetermined, that magic portion, and this is where leadership earns its money, is in that decision-making during the response phase. And infrastructure needs to support all of it. So what is the key question here? That is the planning requirement. How do you get to that minimum sustainable capacity? That is the absolute crux of it in operational terms. From there, we can cascade out all the other aspects. We can work out what the infrastructure needs to do to support not only routine, but to facilitate our reaction, our response, and our recovery. And yes, that does recognize that some infrastructure will fail. But we need to be very focused on what those essential functions are that we're trying to continue. We looked at the characteristics common to those communities that have survived catastrophic events. Here they are. You'll recognize some of them from Jane Jacobs, Jarrett Walker, and various other people who have published on public transport or community building and things like that. A community has a focus, and by focus, this means that people interact with each other. They are aware of other people's circumstances. It doesn't mean that they play on the same soccer team, but it does certainly mean that the community is aware of everyone else in that community. Now, this doesn't apply to just communities, to a neighborhood. It also applies to business. Community identity, whether it's at parish council or a city level, it doesn't really matter. An identity where a community takes ownership of its own destiny. Balanced infrastructure. Ironically enough, this has proved to be probably the key determinant in whether a community will survive. If there is too much infrastructure, or it's too heavy, it destabilizes the community. And similarly, if it's inadequate, the community is constrained, it's restricted. You need a strategic framework. So if that community is functioning perfectly well, it still has a relationship with the city above and with neighboring communities. Now, this is quite an important distinction, quite an important aspect, because it goes to the heart of district energy, goes to the heart of municipal governance, it goes to the heart of regional governance. And how we map out utilities and our ability for utilities to self-recover as a grid and also as a distribution are related directly to this. And the last one, which was raised by a researcher called Boyne, when he looked at 9/11 and Katrina, it's this confidence in leadership. Interestingly enough, actual leadership doesn't really need to be there. It's confidence in leadership. If people are confident in the higher leadership, then they are more inclined to do what they can first before reaching into common resources. But if they have no confidence in the leadership, they will reach for central resources first without touching their own resources. And if you've got a community that does that, it can destabilize an entire city. And we have plenty of examples in North America where one community, one neighborhood, has destabilized the ability of a city to self-recover. So how do we plan for resilience? Well, first of all, the first distinction is it is not infrastructure hardening. Now, New York has had to learn this the hard way. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the power station in Lower Manhattan Island on Avenue C. For Hurricane Donna, the storm surge was 10 feet. And so theory came down, we will harden this vital node to the maximum that history has ever delivered in Manhattan Island. So we'll harden it to 12 foot 6 inches. Great, excellent. We have exceeded the worst case in history. Unfortunately, Sandy came in at 13.8 feet. So the loss was actually catastrophic because it wasn't a resilience plan, it was an infrastructure hardening plan. They'd gone for robustness. Resilience is certainly not that. Resilience is about managing the changes around you, the changes that are happening to you. But everything you do to mitigate the effects of that change upon your operation changes your risk context. So you're never actually solving the problem. You are moving towards a solution, but you're never wholly solving the problem. And that's why you need to be within that strategic framework. You need to say, this is the city we want in 2050. This is what it looks like. This is what we want to move towards. This is what we want our utility to look like in 2050. Because every adjustment you make changes the context in which you operate. As soon as you build a road, the use of that road ceases to be as predicted by the designers. So, we focus on operations before the infrastructure, the purpose of that infrastructure. And ultimately, it comes down to this fundamental question in the series of questions in the planning process. Who do we depend upon? We will rely upon services and infrastructure. We rely upon people. The French National Railway, SNCF, they identified that their key dependency was the train drivers and the engineers and the technicians. I said, well, when we have a major power outage, we can still run our train lines because we have our own independent supply, but the public transport will not bring the drivers and the maintainers to the train. So therefore, we will lay on these little shuttle buses and collect our drivers and mechanics and engineers to bring them to work so that we can continue to provide the service, and therefore people who rely upon us are not inhibited by our deficiency to deliver. So who depends upon us? Understanding who depends upon us allows us to prioritize demand. If we just look at a cluster of use as being a series of megawatt hours, we're actually not understanding what purpose that power is for, or that water is for, or that gas is for. We need to understand what it is for so that we can sensibly prioritize recovery. And how are we affected? And that is we generally. How are we affected by that event? And it's an interesting question. Let's look at that dependency map first. Here we have the City of Toronto operation, broken down into its essential functions. These are the essential functions that, in a catastrophe, these must continue if Toronto is going to survive and self-recover. And all the components of that are in there. Now, each one of these was mapped out in 2012. So here's transportation, for example, and you end up with a series of cluster maps like this. And what happens is that for the road network of transportation, the road network depends upon these particular items. They, in turn, depend upon something else. The yellow boxes around there, that is where you are interfacing directly with the community. So that community now influences your ability to bring in a driver. We know from every catastrophe that has happened, irrespective of what we like to believe, we know that people will look after their families first before they come into work. The Montreal ice storms. Virtually the whole of the eastern seaboard was mobilized to help Quebec, and only about 20% of them turned up. It doesn't matter who you are, where you are, what your self-concept is. It is human nature that we will look after our families first. And so if we rely upon something for a person who is suffering the same problems as we are, do we really think he's going to abandon his family to help out people he does not know? The reality is probably not. You get a few exceptions granted, but no. Now, if you understand that interdependency of systems and functions, and we haven't done this by infrastructure, this is by function and operation. If we understand that, as soon as we relate that to the map, there are a series of nodes that come up as being critical. And they are typically points of conflict, or crossing points, where, for example, here you've got a culvert. This was washed out. This is the Finch culvert, by the way. 18 months of disruption. A couple of million, I believe, in costs. We've got a gas main, a sewer, a couple of power lines. There's all sorts of things going across that culvert. And actually, for Toronto, it was a bit of a near miss. But for the sake of saving a little bit of riverine maintenance, it's probably, that is a key node. That's one of those key nodes. It's probably better to pay it a bit more attention. Now, we understand that better. Here's a trace taken from DIALOG in this particular case, where we look at location risk. And we're saying, you probably recognize the bow and the oxbow from Calgary downtown, and the dark red are the floodplains. the deep pink, I'm assured it's called salmon, is the surface flooding that comes from the floodplains. And then the sort of grayish pink, light pink, that is the power outage related to the surface flooding. Now, we've repeated that for water, potable water. We repeated it for sewerage. We repeated it for communications. We repeated it for public transportation. And so we're able to say, irrespective of where you are in the city, your socks might not be wet, but you no longer have a fire hydrant pressure, you no longer have sewerage, and people can't come to work. So therefore, your fire risk has now gone up immensely. You've got power, but you can't do anything else. So understanding how we are affected directly and indirectly significantly changes our relationship with our immediate risk context. This is a very important form of analysis. And unfortunately, I would say it's something that is very rarely done by a lot of people upon whom we really do depend. They have no idea how they are indirectly affected by other things. Well worth looking at. So we looked at that power in isolation. But here, for example, is the dependency chart for Brockville. There it is in very simplified fashion. We tried to get rid of all the spurious stuff. We try to get rid of food, because after all, people don't need to eat. We try to get rid of shelter and healthcare and things like that. And we said, let's just look at the fundamental of energy transmission and distribution. And that's energy in the round. It was impossible to divorce that from water. We could create an artificial boundary that said, yep, healthcare, absolutely, we know healthcare is a demand cluster. We could isolate food and say, yep, that is a demand cluster, and so on and so forth. But it didn't matter how we managed those dependencies, we could not get drinking water out of that dependency relationship. And when you then georectify that, that's what it looks like. Now, this is very much at the development stage. There are 3 different software applications running there. This is a research project we've got running at the moment. But the thing is, we can then go to that GIS map and stress it with a particular event. And we can find out, through those dependencies, how that event manifests itself in failure. And the vast majority of failure are not the first-order consequences of the event. Typically speaking, we're looking at between 10 and 15% suffer first-order consequence. Everyone else has an indirect resulting failure. So let's bring this back down to energy again. Using a district energy concept, and using a trigen here, where our node, it's a multi-fuel node in itself, but it also acts as a node bringing in diverse power supplies from elsewhere. So it may be a multi-fuel plant, but it also has a supply from wind power and solar power coming in from other areas. The idea here is that that trigen plant, and there's the demand cluster around it for the community that it serves, we need to work out that capacity by our tolerance of loss. What our priorities of supply are, and our footprint. So for example, when we look at the demand, let's take a house in simple terms, or a supermarket is a better one. In a supermarket, when you have a power outage, what would you say is the most important power demand there? Refrigeration, absolutely. It's refrigeration and actually the security. There's a very good example of a supermarket in Western Toronto who lost millions because of a power outage, and they had this massive standby generator. They've turned it on, and it ground to a halt because it hadn't been started in 5 years or whatever it was. The consequences of that was that they had to throw away all their produce, deep clean, all the just-in-time delivery had to be diverted. So the consequences of that process were actually affecting a lot more people than just the supermarket. The losses directly incurred by the supermarket were huge. It took a couple of years to recover in those losses because the insurance company quite rightly said, you should have planned this better. And the issue then came down to, well, how are you going to prioritize your demand? Now, there were 3 or 4, I can't remember exactly, but 3 or 4 circuits that were very important to the continued function of that supermarket. And they were put on a separate demand line. Everything else was just routine supply. And actually, when you looked at that overall power take, it significantly reduced it and made the power management far more accessible, far more economically viable. So in this case, we're looking at the footprint of demand. We're looking at our tolerance of loss. Can a school go without power? Well, if that school is required to provide daycare, even if it's not schooling, provide daycare so that parents can still go to work and do the recovery functions for the city, then actually that school does need to stay open, even if it's not teaching. Most gymnasia are used as disaster victim identification centers and emergency centers and things like that. There is a residual requirement for schools that we still need to consider. You can't just cut them out of the equation. But it's a much lower requirement than ordinarily you'd see. So the rule of thumb that appears to be coming out of all the research is we need 20% more capacity than the demand. And when we relate that to our neighboring communities, that extra 20% is able to cover the neighboring community's loss of power, cover their essential functions in the event of their loss of power. So each community actually supports the other one and becomes interdependent. But the whole lot has to fit within a strategic plan, within a strategic framework. And understanding those interdependencies between neighborhoods and as it relates to the main grid is important. It would appear that the optimum solution is a powered grid system of whatever description with this district energy, this cluster, interdependent cluster approach of networks at a smaller scale. That appears to be the most efficient balance, allowing for that interdependency of different utilities. The interesting thing is that when you don't do that, take that interdependency of utilities into account, you come up with different answers. There's our goal. Very clear, very simple. And our approach has to be a strategic one. It has to understand the full context of what we're talking about, and it has to say, this is what we are trying to achieve, and we will move towards it. We cannot solve it in one go. There is no universal panacea, there is no golden bullet, whatever analogy you want to use. There is no way that you can come up with a solution today and say, I have just solved the problem. You need to say, this is our vision for what we want to be in 25 years' time. And the way we make our infrastructure investment decisions today, we make them within our own budgets and what we can afford. But as long as we are going in that direction and we've taken account of resilience, then actually that investment will be an efficient one and will contribute towards that end state, so that we're running sustainable development and resilience together. Resilience is not the goal, it's a tool to get you to that goal of sustainable development. Thank you very much.
Just before Alex leaves the floor, I thought we'd take a few minutes, just while we have the time, just for a minute or two, in case you have some questions that you are just burning to ask Alex right now. I think it'd be great if we could just get those. And I'll see if we just grab a floor mic from here, see if I can just run around.
Good morning, Alec. Enjoyed that very much. I think we got off quite lightly with the ice storm power outage, because if the polar vortex had descended during that time, the consequences would have been quite catastrophic relative to what they were. Have you done any modeling on what would have occurred had we been in the middle of -20 with -35 wind chill?
Not directly, no. What has been quite evident is that Toronto and Boston have been uncommonly fortunate in their experience of catastrophe. You know, in Boston, they were exactly 6 hours out of sync to have suffered the same sort of flooding as New York, because the tides were just wrong for when the Sandy surge happened. Similarly, here in Toronto, the downpour in the summer, for example, happened at just the right time that the impact would be minimal. The impact of the freeze, sorry, the power outage, the ice storm power outage, it was nowhere near what it could have been. Absolutely nowhere near. We were very fortunate, given the lack of power to charge waterhead and things like that, that there was not one otherwise small and manageable event that did not coincide. If it had, I think it would have all gone very pear-shaped very quickly. Look at other disasters around the world. They have a natural disaster, a big event like that, and literally just one small, normally very manageable event just makes it completely unmanageable, and it becomes a catastrophe. No, I think we've been very lucky. We have been very lucky on several occasions.
We'll take just one more question, if there is one on the floor. No, that's you.
Alex, great presentation. One of the questions I have is that my impression is that people today are more willing to take risk than I seem to recall 20 or 30 years ago. Am I just dreaming in Technicolor, or? Because there does seem to be, and I've really enjoyed your presentation, and I find myself just looking around and kind of saying, yeah, this is exactly as you've described. There would be cause here to be a little more careful or a little more prudential, and I never cease to be amazed at the willingness of people to take risk, and at the risk of offending anybody in the room. I mean, it's like watching that Wall Street crowd a few years ago. It's as though Newtonian physics doesn't apply to a certain part of New York State, you know, and so let's aggregate some really bad risk, and on the basis of this foundation, let's build some kind of tower. And then everybody was surprised when it kind of came down. Well, it couldn't stand. The only question was, how long would it be before it unraveled? So my question to you is it fair to say that there seems to be a greater appetite for risk-taking than might have been the case 25 years ago?
No, I would say it's actually the reverse. I think the real issue is that our risk environment has become far more complex than our parents used to deal with. And we understand less the consequences of our own actions. We understand less the consequences of voting for someone who says X, Y, or Z, because we're simply not informed about what it means. And so I would say that risk-taking today is less about a risk appetite, and it's more about making uninformed risk decisions.
Just give a round of applause to Alex for this morning. That was great. Thank you. We're just going to do a little bit of transition here right now. Sorry, Alex. Just as I'm inviting the panel to start to come up to take their seats, I'm going to give a quick overview of some of the research projects that we have on the go here at Quest that are, I think, of direct relevance to today's topic and presentation. And as Alex was speaking, a couple of images came to my mind that I've had a chance to hear firsthand through people. And that was someone who went right through the Christchurch earthquake and who saw firsthand about disaster planning and risk mitigation. And prior to that, they used to work at the City of Toronto. And the interesting analogy he gave is the connection between water and energy. I think that's something that we don't often think about on a regular basis. And if you can recall, during our power outage for the Eastern Seaboard area, in the Toronto context, this is a point that is often a little bit missed, was at that time, so we're going back a number of years now, there was about 48 hours of water supply in the system. Now, you have to remember something about potable water, is that it has to be kept at a certain pressure in the lines within a good engineering and health standard, because if it's not, then it can be exposed to contamination. So if you could imagine the entire good portion of the GTA, which water's pumped up through Toronto, during that period, that power outage was a bit longer than 48 hours. So imagine after 48 hours, that entire area of the GTA, more or less, without potable water, potentially, because the system would have had to be flushed before it could be restored. Interesting situation. It's a different thing that we don't often think about in terms of our parallel analysis. There's three projects I just want to go over with you quickly that I think you'll find of relevance and interest. Richard Laszlo, who's here in the audience, he's our Director of Research and Education. One of the key areas that I just want to point you towards that we've just launched across Canada is called Resilient Pipes and Wires. The initiative is really looking at the role of distribution utilities and their challenges with responding to changing environments. So Richard would be delighted to speak further with you and how that project's advancing. There's a brief backgrounder on our current website that you might find of interest as well. And it outlines the various partners who are engaged in that project, which include many of who are here today. Canadian Electricity Association, the Canadian Gas Association, the International District Energy Association, and others who are all actively now engaged in trying to better understand the challenges of distribution utilities, including ICLEI, the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives. The other major activity we have going on this year that I just want to draw your attention to is our Quest 2014, Innovation to Implementation. It's our upcoming conference. It will be hosted December 1st to 3rd, 2014. It's being held at in Vancouver at the Weston Bayshore. I hope all of you have your BlackBerry out now and can put that in your schedules, because we'd be delighted to have you there. And if you can imagine, one of the key themes that will be being discussed at that session will be focused on the importance of resiliency. Last, we've also just launched for this year our products and services guide for 2014. I would encourage all of you to speak to two people if you're interested in what we're doing on a regular basis across Canada, with Todd Latham, who's here in the audience, he's in the back, or Eric Campbell, who's here, and he's been helping to address and run our activities related to our QUESTtalks. Without further ado, I am really delighted to have Brian Denny, who will serve as our moderator for the session today. Brian is the Chief Executive Officer of the Toronto Region Conservation Authority. Brian has been at the TRCA for a number of years in various positions. He's led the development of waterfront parks. He's the extensive shoreline protection works, activities, and many, many other initiatives. But more recently, and through my own work with Brian over the number of years, there's three things that I think he's done extremely well with TRCA. One is help provide regional guidance and direction on things related to the importance of water and energy, something that TRCA has done work on and is represented through different programs that they do now. The other aspect is TRCA put in, and I believe they still are, engaged with the World Building Green Council as well. So Brian, I'll turn over the panel to you for the remainder of the morning. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Brent. It's my pleasure to be here, and a great honor to be part of this distinguished panel. I'm sitting in the middle to try to keep peace as this starts to heat up. I can sense it's going to get lively soon, and I want you to be thinking about questions, because we want to save the last half hour or so to have an opportunity for you to interact with the panel. So as Brent said, I really come at this more from the water side than the energy side. Listening to Alex's presentation, I guess I like to think that what we've been doing in the conservation authorities in Ontario for the last 60 years is responding to one of the greatest crises that ever hit this part of Canada, and that was Hurricane Hazel. So I've been there for 40 years, largely trying to implement some of the big picture public policy decisions that came as a result of that disaster, where 81 people were killed. There were millions and millions of dollars worth of damage. And we've been implementing a program ever since that really looked at the fact that it really didn't make sense in our geography to have major communities that were establishing and growing on the floor of our valley systems. So, I'd like to think that it is a higher level of performance that Alex referred to, although that's quite debatable. We still have design standards that were based on that actual event. So maybe we could debate about whether that was serious enough. I think the July 8th event tested that. You've probably seen in the media there was lots of claims that the July 8th event was bigger than Hazel. In fact, it wasn't. It was probably only about a third of the total rainfall of Hurricane Hazel, but the 1 hour peak intensity was far greater than anything that occurred in Hurricane Hazel. So there were some great lessons learned there. $1 billion worth of damage in Toronto, most of it, virtually all of it, in older parts of the communities where they had been built prior to Hazel without as much attention to the details of overland flow and energy grade lines in sewers and so on, resulting in lots of basement flooding. And I guess the good news from our perspective of that event was that the damage was not occurring in areas that had been designed, say, since the early 1980s, when our current approach to stormwater management was first developed. So that's the perspective that I bring to this. I know this is largely about energy. We certainly do some things in the energy field using our influence where we can to try to argue in support of district energy systems. But I'll leave it at that for my perspective. We're fortunate to have a number of panelists here who bring a broad perspective, and I'll be happy to introduce them to you now. On my right is Carrie Lakatos Hayward. Carrie joined Enbridge Gas Distribution in 1995, and she's held a variety of senior roles within Enbridge, including economics and finance, marketing, business development, strategic planning, operations, and customer care. Her current role as Director of Customer Care involves accountability for all aspects of customer care, including call centers, billing, meter reading, and collections for the utility's 2 million Ontario customers. Carrie is accountable for the utility's overall customer experience strategy, providing her with unique insights into customer expectations, particularly in emergency response situations. Carrie holds a BA in Economics and a Master's of Science in Planning, both from the University of Toronto. She has also successfully completed the Queen's Executive Program and a certificate in carbon finance. So please welcome Carrie to the panel. On my left is Joyce McLean. Joyce is a policy and communication specialist in the environmental and energy field. She has a broad range of experience in the corporate and nonprofit world. Joyce is a 14-year veteran of Toronto Hydro, a board member of several organizations, including a Renewable Energy Industry Association, and has developed corporate, political, and bureaucratic communications and strategies over the last 30 years, and is a media spokesperson on a multitude of issues. And we're fortunate to have Joyce with us this morning. Please welcome her. And at this end of the table is Rob Thornton, who is President and CEO of the International District Energy Association, an industry association founded 105 years ago with headquarters near Boston. In his primary role as advocate for the district energy industry, Mr. Thornton represents the interests of more than 1,800 members from 26 countries and has briefed the President of the United States and members of his cabinet, members of Congress, senior leaders at the U.S. Department of Energy, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Commerce, as well as other international connections, and he's active promoting district energy around the world. During his 26 years in the district energy industry, Mr. Thornton led the startup and growth of new downtown district energy systems in 3 different cities. He serves as on the executive committee of the International District Energy Implementing Agreement and participates in various collaborative efforts on the international stage. He's a graduate of Tufts University in Medford, Massachusetts. So please welcome Rob. We have a few questions that have been shared with the panel as a way of getting this started. Alec has set the stage for us in terms of what resilience is and how we need to think about energy in that context. As we all know, in Ontario, there's been a great focus on energy in recent years, from the Green Energy Act, feed-in tariffs, siting of gas plants, the update of the long-term energy plan, regional energy planning, and even some community energy planning. So we'd like to start the discussion with thoughts from each of the panelists on what constitutes a smart energy community and the importance of energy in the discussion of community resilience. So I've asked Carrie to make some initial remarks from the gas perspective.
Thanks very much. This is the first time that I've heard Alex speak, and I found myself nodding quite a bit. A lot of what he was saying really resonated with some of the experiences that Enbridge Gas Distribution has been experiencing. And as I reflected, what does resilience really mean? You know, I think some of the things that we've got to think about is how we adapt to our changing environment systems around us today. I think for sure, whether it's environment, weather conditions, or even other disruptive events, it is definitely a different time and place. So we need to be designing our energy and critical infrastructure to be able to absorb and recover as quickly as possible. And I think that part of the issue is that we've taken a very functional approach to both planning our systems up till now and how we respond. And I think we've got to start looking at things from a process perspective, right through from the planning, design, and build, but also elevating the role of emergency planning as a critical part of our energy infrastructure and response. So I think there are some principles around resilience that we've got to keep in mind. It really talks about diversity of supply in energy, avoiding single points of failure, you know, having integrated planning and independence in our systems, parallel pathways and networks. And in that way, so that we can, when we do have these adverse conditions, we can minimize the frequency and impact of failure, and that we really are building resilience at a community level. I think the last point I'd want to make is, as it relates to the community aspect, and I was thinking back to some of the experiences in the ice storm, where we had a lot of, although it was principally an electrical issue, definitely there was an impact on the natural gas. We had lots of calls coming into our call center. Hey, my gas is not working. And that talks about the interdependence of a lot of natural gas equipment today on the electrical system. And we need, and I think we'll get into it a little bit through this discussion, but I think that there's a real importance for our customers, for our stakeholders, to understand and their energy systems in the home, and to start having emergency plans for themselves. How are they planning their building and energy systems, so that we're not just relying on electricity. We've got natural gas, but we're also understanding how they work together. I think that's some probably good introductory remarks.
Good, thanks, Gary. Joyce, could I ask you for some initial comments from the electricity sector?
Absolutely. So I guess one of the things that was missing from my bio is that I actually work at Toronto Hydro, and that I run the office of the president at Toronto Hydro. So I should have included that. So I think that, from my perspective, I think that we need to be thinking more in the context of climate change and what that's going to mean for the Toronto region. So there's been some work done by the City of Toronto already, looking at what the future scenarios are. So really what that breaks down to is that we're going to have more summer storms, even though our overall precipitation across the year is not going to go up. It's going to be more concentrated in the summer. So flooding, like what we saw in July last year, is going to become more of a problem for all utilities and for the city itself. We're going to see warmer temperatures. We're going to see greater variability, and we've already seen some of that this year, obviously with the ice storm in particular. So I think that the existing policies provincially that govern our energy systems overall, I think they're heading in the right direction. With conservation and efficiency as the first principles, that seems to make a lot of sense to me. And in terms of then looking at using our natural systems in the best possible way. So an emphasis on renewables. Also, though, the interdependencies of our natural green, like leafy green infrastructure, like trees and things that can actually soak up all that extra rain that we're going to be experiencing as in the summers to come, for instance. So I think we need to be looking at how we plan and maintain our electricity systems in the context of our actual natural systems. One of the issues, obviously, during the ice storm was that we had a lot of tree contacts on wires. Well, that's inevitable because the electricity system and the trees are planted in, they're both in the same public right-of-way. So there's going to be an inevitable conflict. We need to fix that. That's not our issue, though. That's a municipal policy issue. And that's something that we're going to all have to grapple with because we like our trees, and so we should. It keeps our communities friendly. It makes them, it increases the happiness index in cities when we have a lots of green space. So it's something that we need to all work together on. I think, though, that one of the really critical things is that we need to have an educated consumer, and I would suggest right now that we don't. And I really liked what Alex said earlier about the fact that there seems to be a lot more risk-taking without information. And we try, and I know Enbridge does the same thing, we feed people as much information as we possibly can, but the only time they really pay attention is when the systems aren't working, and then they want information immediately. So I think that somehow we need to be able to create more value associated with the importance of electricity, because it really underscores everything we do in society. And yet, we don't want to pay for it, and we don't really have a lot of value associated with. So that's a really critical issue that we're going to have to grapple with together.
Thank you, Joyce. Rob, could we ask you for your initial comments, please?
Sure. I'd be remiss if first I didn't congratulate all my Canadian colleagues on your double hockey gold. Well done. Well done. Some American women are still smarting, however. I put it behind me. I was going to wear a paper bag, but I realized there weren't that many people from Finland going to be here. 5-0. Okay. Well, so a smart energy community. I think, really a smart energy community must have a thermal grid. If you're really going to be robust and resilient and really have, I think, the assets you need to maintain business continuity, you should have a thermal provision. Most of our large cities, in fact, if you looked at our universities, and some of our universities started operating really before there was an electric utility or even a gas utility. And so they were sort of, independent in a way. And when you have a thermal grid, then that creates an opportunity for combined heat and power, cogeneration. You have a use for the thermal. So a smart energy community, I would take a page from our campuses, who in many cases are not just a place that houses students and learning, but many of our U.S. universities process millions, tens of millions of dollars worth of research every year. And so they cannot afford any downtime on utilities. If you have cancer research that goes back decades, not only do you need to keep the lights on, but the room has to be at the right temperature and humidity continuously. And so our universities have sort of learned to, be resilient and build these assets and maintain them. And back to Alex's point, it isn't just, we can't think of these systems as just sort of for emergency. They really do need to be, robust and resilient. And I think our communities are now, after Sandy, mayors are now looking for what Princeton and some of these campuses that stayed online, they're now looking for what they have. And we're seeing a big uptick in sort of request for information for how to build, district energy assets in our cities. So I think business continuity is really becoming, the losses in Sandy were over, the total losses were $72 billion. The business continuity losses were well over $2 billion. So it counts. We're talking real money real quick.
Thanks, Rob. Maybe on that note, could I just ask you to carry on with some more specifics about what we may have learned from these specific events in major urban centers? And just before you start, let me thank you for being so gracious to bring up the hockey connection. I had thought of leading with that this morning, and I just thought that would be really cruel. But it was very gracious of you to give us an opportunity to just continue.
I thought I'd take that one on the chin,
a little bit.
Get in the penalty box.
We appreciate that.
You did.
Yes.
Well, I felt like I was reliving actually the Stanley Cup where the Bruins lost in, 17 seconds too, so kind of a Groundhog Day.
Talk to us about Boston.
Yeah, Groundhog Day. I think it's fundamental that when, if you're really looking at energy assets, the world community is growing to 9 billion people. 7 billion will be residing in cities. We can't just have our cities rely on gas and wires, going forward. As the population densifies, we have to be using thermal that's nearby, not just, making out of fossil and making out of, operations. We have to be recovering heat and using that, or like you do here, taking cold out of the lake to air condition your city. These take capital investments, some vision, some obviously significant investment. But Sandy showed us that it's possible to sort of stand up, but you can't maintain 100% operation 100% of the time. I don't think we can afford that. Even our campus systems are sized for 85% of the electricity load, and oftentimes 100% of the thermal load. And what's little known is that in the U.S., I suppose you see U.S. News and World Report, that magazine comes out. Last year, 17 of the top 20 hospitals were served by district energy systems. So they got their energy from a nearby, often it's a university, but the district energy industry actually has a history of reliability and resilience. We stood up to the earthquake of Loma Prieta in San Francisco in 1989 and 1994. an ice storm of Ottawa, the Montreal steam system stayed online. Now, partly it's because the pipes are underground, but these are, very robust, resilient systems. And, and I think if you really want a smart energy community, you need to have some pipes. You need to have some thermal grid, at least for your core. And that's been our experience. And when you have a thermal grid, then you can have local generation, combined heat and power, cogeneration, and that's at Princeton and Co-op City. Final point, Co-op City is in the Bronx of New York. It's a community of 60,000 people, has 60 megawatts of cogeneration. During the storm, they supplied power to Con Edison. 8 million people were without power in 21, the storm was 21 states. It was a huge storm. 8 million people were without power. But, our beacons of light were our district energy CHP systems.
Thanks, Rob. And what about Joyce from the electricity sector? Specific things we've learned from these major events? I know in the July 8th event it was more a Hydro 1 issue, but if you could just provide some perspective.
Sure. Obviously, in July of last year, we had a big flooding problem, and we had 300,000 Toronto Hydro customers who were out, but it wasn't our equipment. So this is a challenge because we don't own the system that Hydro One does, and while it's obviously important to get everything back up and running as quickly as possible, Hydro One's view is that Toronto Hydro is a customer. They didn't see that there were 300,000 customers. They just saw that one customer had a problem. So there is this mindset, I think, that needs reshaping in that there needs to be responsibility for the end-use customer taken by all of the agencies who supply electricity. So having said that, though, and a lot of people went, oh my God, why do we have all wires underground? Okay, so there was that response in July because there was too much water in the system. But during the ice storm, it was like, why don't we have our wires underground? Because otherwise we wouldn't have tree contact with wires. So I think the one conclusion to that is that none of the systems we currently have are perfect. And as Rob said, we can't guarantee that, excuse me, 100% of the time you're going to have 100% electricity. So this is obviously a challenge, but what it leads to is one of my earlier points, which is we need an educated consumer, and we need to have that consumer be prepared for the inevitability of some kind of outage. So we need to have home-based emergency preparedness kits. We need, for instance, like one of the things we discovered during the ice storm, which was kind of shocking, is that we got an email, or I got an email from somebody at St. Mike's Hospital who said, oh my God, can't you do something, because we have an influx, we're getting overloaded with dialysis patients because they don't have anywhere else to go. They can't plug in at home like they usually did, so they're flooding the hospital. Can't you attend to these specific individuals? And the answer is, well, no, we can't. We can't go to, we have about 900 individuals who have voluntarily registered with Toronto Hydro, so we know that they have some sort of electronic device need. But we can't fix their individual addresses. That's not the way the restoration system works. So, but this is obviously a challenge, and one that we had never encountered before, but it's something that we obviously need to think about. I harken back to what Alex said about where people spend their resources, and if they go to the central resource first or whether they use their own is a really interesting question. And so apparently we went to, or these dialysis patients went to their central resource first because they weren't prepared to, and they are much more vulnerable than all of us in this room, I would suggest, yet they didn't have any means of backup for their own really critical personal needs. So I think those are some of the lessons we learned. And again, I say that, no system is 100% perfect. So we all need to be mindful of that. And we need to work much better together across, especially in the municipal government level, to ensure that we can help each other because we have obvious interdependencies.
Thanks, Joyce. And from the gas sector, Carrie, any specific learnings and actions that you're taking as a result of these events?
Definitely. We've talked on this panel that, the extreme weather conditions are becoming more frequent. They're no longer are you planning for once in 100-year type situations. These are unpredictable events that are becoming more frequently. We have to plan our systems around that. And I think equally as importantly, as essential sectors in our urban infrastructure, we have to be prepared as providers of these services to get up and running and recover as quickly as possible. That's the expectation of our customers, and those expectations of customers are becoming even more rapid and fluid today than they ever have been. Sort of a bit tongue-in-cheek, but I would argue that in the recent ice storm, the biggest demand was probably plug power to charge cell phones. It's the first thing people thought of. Oh my God, I need to get connected. The demand for information when when power or gas is out, they want to know. Customers want to know, when am I going to get restored? And they want it here and they want it now, and they're not prepared to wait. I think that's the reality as utility service providers we have to deal with. So we have to be very conscious both in our customer communications, how we respond in our call centers, et cetera, and different ways that we communicate out in social media, which is the focus that we're having to put on social media is exponential compared to 2 years, 5 years ago. So those are things that really are important lessons learned. Also, in my earlier remarks, I alluded to the point that our emergency planning, we used to kind of put it in a bit of a corner. That's part of operations. We'll do some business resumption planning, but that's on one side. Now that's really core part of our day-to-day planning. We've got to make sure that we've got mutual assistance arrangements in place with other gas utilities. We at Enbridge, we do training and participate in emergency planning exercises, both with first responders, but also key agencies, whether it's utilities or municipal, provincial government. And so it really talks about an incident command system. And that when you do have these severe events, there's got to be a unified command so that we are able to work together in a very collaborative fashion to get the systems back up and running. So again, maybe a few years ago it used to be, yeah, it's important, but that's over here. But that's now really a core part of what we've got to plan for going forward.
I think that leads us in nicely, Carrie, to one of the challenges that Alec gave us is that this really is an issue that requires high-level strategic plans that integrate a lot of things. Can we explore that a little bit more as to where you folks think we need progress, starting federally, provincially, municipally, and then with the various industries? How do we do a better job of getting these plans more integrated? Rob, could I throw that to you as a start?
Yeah, I think these plans have to emerge from the local level first, because mayors are really accountable to their citizens. We've heard from city planners, sustainability directors who have said, we dodged a bullet with Sandy, but if we were responsible for housing, if the lights went out and the grid were down and people were really at risk for, days at a time, how would we accommodate them? And so, our mayors are saying, well, I need an area of refuge. I need to think about a place where they can come and be, accommodated. So that island really does need to almost be, self-sustaining. So it needs local generation. It needs to be robust. We can't have a remake of the Houston Astrodome where people were sweltering and actually more at risk. I think most communities do need a center, an area of refuge. And we see that on college campuses. Same thing happens. They cascade the criticality. So, on a college campus, for those of you who have like I do, have a daughter at college, they're not the first tier. You'd like to think, but they're very important, but it's actually the laboratory mice that are the most important tenants on a campus. Millions of dollars, cancer research, et cetera. And so our universities have done a pretty good job of allocating, critical resources to highest and best need, and they will cascade down from there. So I think we can learn from them. It begins at the mayors. States can coordinate that. States and provinces can coordinate that. I think they can play a convening role, to find best practices in our communities and sort of bubble those up and have better exchange. At a federal level, I'm going to Washington tonight. I'll be there tomorrow. Sometimes I wonder why. I feel like a gerbil on a wheel. Nothing is really happening in Washington, in all frankness. But we are seeing, though, at least attention to climate change and adaptability. We have some agencies that I think have, after 9/11, which seems like so long ago, there have been resources directed at emergency planning and response. So I think it has to start locally, and the role of government, I think, is to sort of enable, sort of these best practices to be, to be shared and reinforced. I'd like to think there was money to support it. That's not always so easy to find. But that's my start. I'd like to yield to my colleagues.
Okay, thanks, Rob.
Yep.
Maybe, Carrie, I'll come back to you. You work nationally. Are you seeing any sign of national or provincially led leadership that is responding to the results of the recent events in Calgary and Toronto?
Well, that's a kind of a loaded question, but one of the comments I was going to make was on an emergency planning. Yes, I mean we are seeing action, and we work very I think collaboratively with our provincial and municipal counterparts. I think one of the points I wanted to stress on that area is that system and structure is fairly voluntary, and so we've got, I think good cooperation, particularly amongst government agencies. But one of the critical things to keep in mind is that we've got a lot of infrastructure that's owned by private sector, and so they don't always fall into part of that realm in an incident command structure. So our system, and so getting them involved in emergency planning is a little bit more challenging. So I think that's one of the things that we could improve upon is, how do we get the private sector more involved? As an example, it's maybe a small example, but at Enbridge, with the weather that we've been having, the cold weather, we have a lot of customers who are on interruptible rates, and we have a lot of customers who, when we do call on them to stop using natural gas in a curtailment instance, they come back and with, oh, my equipment didn't work, or, it really wasn't maintained, or something was broken. And so I think it really talks about whether it's end-use customer or an owner of large infrastructure, that they're testing equipment, especially critical infrastructure, and they're making sure that it works adequately. Again, perhaps a little bit of a smaller example, but it just shows that customers and private sector really have an important role to play in emergency planning. Just a couple of other points that I wanted to bring up. From where can we show leadership? I think it's sort of recognizing that energy policy and investment in energy infrastructure can't be around the lowest cost. And my perspective is it sometimes comes down to the lowest cost to provide that solution. And I think we've got to really build in the need for redundancy, for excess capacity, to improve the resilience of our energy systems. And that's got to be a key objective, not just delivering energy at the lowest cost. you know, I think my colleague from Toronto Hydro talked a lot about increasing public awareness as well. And that's something that really, maybe we all have a shared responsibility around that, but there definitely is a role from the public, the provincial and municipal sector on that.
Okay, thanks, Carrie. And back to you then, Joyce, on this issue of the big picture integration.
Well,
Rob says it has to come from the municipalities, so
Yeah.
you're on the front line.
Well, I think it does have to come from the municipality and it has to go up, but that doesn't mean, I'm not letting the federal government or the provincial governments off the hook here. I think the, you know, the details and the logistics have to come from the ground up, but obviously we need money. And I think it is the responsibility of the provincial and federal governments to support and fund these kinds of activities. Because, as we've all alluded, there's a lot of lost downtime, business continuity costs, you know, billions of dollars, you know, are not productively used during outages and so on. So I would say that, you know, we have seen some good activity in Toronto. Civic Action, which is an organization many of you might know, a few years back now started something called Weatherwise, and one of my colleagues, Todd Hall, sits on the electricity sector, whatever it's called. I forget what it's called, but it's basically, yes, Todd's over there. But it's basically a result of you know, an informal survey taken during a Civic Action meeting, which had about 100 people, and everybody said, we're talking about what's going to happen, what is the most critical problem that we should be addressing as a sort of cross-cutting business, community, sort of volunteer organization. And everybody said electricity. So we have been working hard as Weatherwise and still to try to identify where we can work more collaboratively and so on. So that's been a helpful exercise. But I would say, though, that, you know, for Toronto Hydro specifically, 30% of our infrastructure is beyond its useful life. Okay, so that's a big cost. And we have capital plans that we hope that will get funded through the Ontario Energy Board of about $400 million a year for the next decade, just to get on top of the aging part, not even to really prepare for, you know, storm hardening. I mean, that's part of it, but, you know, more modern technologies, some storage, you know, things like this. So definitely technology change is part of what we need to be looking at. And I think that what Carrie's saying about the backup generators is really important, because we heard story after story during the ice storm where backup generators, which were there, had been purchased but had not been tested, didn't work. So all of the sunk dollars that those companies had and public entities had spent were pretty much useless without the testing, without the maintenance. So I think maintenance is a really key thing to think about. But then I think backing up, like, to bigger picture, the Canadian Electricity Association, which is the sort of umbrella agency for all the electricity utilities, very much has climate change, resilience, and adaptability in its sites right now, and is working a lot collaboratively to try to figure out what, in fact, are the best practices and how we can move towards those. But I think I go back to my key point. Until we have the consumer support for the value for electricity, and therefore cost increases, which are inevitable, then we're going nowhere fast.
Right. If I could just add to Joyce's comment, I think I couldn't agree more. You know, the value of something when you don't have it, you know, quickly triples or quadruples, right? Fresh air. Think about if you've ever been in a confined space. And we do undervalue electricity, and we do, you know, sort of don't take responsibility for it. In the state of Connecticut, they had 2 storms in a row, knocked out the power for weeks at a time. The governor said, you know, what are we, a third world nation? This isn't allowable. We can't have, and so they, you know, they put together a plan, and they put $20 million into what they call microgrids. really what they came up with were emergency generators with extension cords to the police station and the gas station, you know, which isn't really, you know, was a response. I'm not sure it was the most informed response. So I think our industry, you know, we need to take responsibility for informing government what good infrastructure investment, what good policy looks like, what they should be striving for, so that we don't end up with, you know, I don't know, if everything's a hammer, if all you have is a hammer, everything's a nail, you know, just these sort of quick response. And at IDA last week, we stood up a group called the Microgrid Resources Coalition. And really the challenge is that the policies currently in place, and, you know, in all fairness to my you know, electricity brethren, don't really allow these assets to flourish and be deployed and get their full value. So partly we've got to look at this three-level chessboard that we all operate in, of policy, regulation, price, and get to solutions that really make sense and allow assets to be available, and not the snowblower you didn't use in 3 years, you expect to start on the first pull. You know, that's what we're seeing. Generators in the garage that, you know, shouldn't be expected to start and don't. And, you know, so I think it's incumbent on industry to inform our policy leaders what makes the best, you know, future.
Thanks, Rob. I know we've got a lot of experienced and interested folks in the audience. We want to open up for questions, but I think probably one of the things that would be most helpful coming out of this is if we had some alignment around what are the next 3 or 4 steps that need to happen in our communities to try to move this agenda forward. So I'm going to ask the panelists if they can give us their thoughts on what are those 3 or 4 critical next steps. And Alec, maybe I'll add you to that list if you have some thoughts in that regard. And then once we've heard from the panelists on that note, to try to give us a little bit of a focal point, then we'll open it up for questions. So please get your questions ready for the panel. Joyce, are you ready to start?
Well, I can throw a couple ideas out. I think, and I've already mentioned one, which is the notion that I think every citizen, every household anyway, should have some sort of emergency preparedness kit. I mean, I know that there are the survivalists out there who do this. My son-in-law happens to be one of those. He could go out and survive in the bush, not a problem, right? My daughter's not so thrilled about that, but nevertheless. So I think that that's something that Toronto Hydro really feels quite strongly about. But we haven't really moved on that yet, but we're thinking about how we can do that, and we'd obviously need a number of partners to be able to get that off the ground, so to speak. I think the other one is going back to, you know, Rob alluded to policy matters. Well, it's not just energy policy here, it's other forms of public policy, it's municipal policy, and one I mentioned, which is where the trees are planted and where the wires go, because there is a conflict now, and that needs to change, because we don't want our city to be devoid of trees. They're very important. They keep you know, the electricity costs down in the summer. I mean, shade makes people happy. Green space makes people very happy. There's a whole happiness index that talks a lot about nature. And you know, we need to figure out a way to, you know, cohabit better than we have. So that's something that is not in our purview. We don't own the trees. The city owns the trees, yet they plant them in a space where they don't want conflict, yet that's inevitable. So I think that's another really important thing that we need to sort out going forward. And I guess I'll just leave it at there for now.
Okay, thanks, Joyce. Carrie, some specific next steps?
Yeah. I was thinking about the remark Joyce made about aging infrastructure, and I think it's probably not a coincidence that in our large urban areas they tend to have the oldest infrastructure as well, and that's where the densification tends to have happened first. And so whether it's electricity or gas, you know, that's where we've got aging infrastructure that is more costly to maintain, and also increasingly important for us to replace and invest in upgrading of that equipment. And I don't think that's necessarily an issue or a thing that you could say it's infrastructure hardening. No, this is, I think when we do make those investments, you know, they've got to be done with resilience in mind, which is really around planning for redundancy, planning for things like two-way feeds in your system, looking at an integrated network approach. I think that's really important. And in order to do that, we have to inform the debate with stakeholders, with whether it's interveners, it's politicians, to say this isn't really around we're gold plating a system, but we've got to move the debate to what is the true value of energy to our society. And I think that's really critical, because too often than not, it seems like the debate is around how do we get rates as low as possible, and it often is because that's what's politically expedient and the politicians want, if I dare say so. I think my other comment, perhaps we're all in a violent agreement here, but public education is really important. And is it public education? Is it around just educating so we don't continually have issues around NIMBYism? But I think it's also around what is the value and how should you as a customer or user of the system be planning to use the system? What is your emergency plan? And how are you going to respond when you don't have power, you don't have gas? So I think having an informed, educated consumer is really key to this as well.
Thanks, Carrie. And Rob, critical next steps?
Yes, thanks. We at IDEA a few years back received the Community Energy Development Guide that was written in the UK. And the UK is really going after district heating right now in a big way, recovering heat from power plants. We recently revised that, we revised it for the US market, because America is different than Great Britain, and last year revised it again for the Canadian market. So there's now a Canadian Community Energy Development Guide. So it's really sort of a bottom-up glide path, if you will. You know, at a 30,000 foot level, what do you look for to build a sustainable energy asset in your community? How do you analyze the thermal grids? How do you make economic decisions? Who are your critical anchor customers? What are the economics of this? And then there's sometimes as I fly, you sort of circle back around and some iterations to it. So we've tried to create a menu, a glide path, and Brad has copies with him for how to go about as a planner, as a mayor, thinking about attracting the economics that you need, because these are not pilot programs, ladies and gentlemen. These are big capital investments, public-private partnerships, hybrid, municipal schemes, and Canada in many ways is really leading the pack. I'm trying to import the progress you've made here in places like Markham and Guelph, to bring that to inform our mayors in the U.S. that it can be done. Your market's a little bit different. You have municipal power, et cetera. But I think the first step is really kind of giving people the insight to, how to make these investments make economic sense, and what goes into that. And we've been working, final point, with the Department of Energy, U.S., and developed a screening tool, so that it gives you a red, yellow, green light look at is there a good district energy opportunity here? Red means no, there just isn't enough density, the build out is too long, the cost of energy is too high. Yellow, yeah, that might make sense, there's opportunity. And then green means, yeah, this investment might really work. And that screening tool is to help communities make then the next investment, the next decision to spend time and money on engineering, more investment grade audit. And so at IDA, we're trying to help our communities, move through the process more quickly, more effectively, because we don't want to just see 3-ring binders and, and big, expensive studies and no projects. So, that's the action we've taken to kind of, engage at a local level to inform the process.
Great, thanks, Rob. And Alec, from your global perspective, and as you come to get to know the GTA, do you have some specific steps we should be taking to prepare more strategically?
Well, I think first of all, I would say that having seen some of the best and the worst of human nature, I I have eternal faith in human beings to make the right decision when it matters. There are a couple of issues about how the decisions are reached, though. And let's be fair, money is linked to votes. You can't budget for something. You can't say, federal government is not going to give you money if voters are not prepared to vote for an increase in taxes to compensate. Similarly, Toronto would much rather vote in a mayor who's getting rid of public transport as opposed to putting one in that wants more public transport. And really it comes down to a question of what does the electorate want? Because at the end of the day, politicians will deliver what the electorate wants in a sort of visceral way as opposed to anything else. So if we recognize that that money is linked to votes, so a voter will look at a politician, will look at the government, and say, what have I got for that money that I have agreed to pay? Now, protection and security are very visible. So after 9/11, for example, or the new guards and the cameras and things like that, people could see it was a tangible effect of what that money was being used for. Resilience, you can't see. It's intangible. And so there are very few people out there who actually have such complete faith in politicians. That when a politician says, trust me, we're now more resilient than we were before. Give me more money and I'll make us even more resilient. And people will just say, yep, okay, I'll vote for him. So it's just not going to happen. And so really the issue becomes, how do you intelligently inform public debate? I don't think you can drive a single agenda. It needs to be an intelligent debate. And the question becomes, how do you make it an intelligent debate? And you can't rely on the politicians, you can't rely on the general public, and just educating people. Public Safety Canada tried to educate everybody about the 72-hour pack. They've had less than 5% of the population take it up, despite heavy advertising campaigns, leaflets through everybody's door. Nobody's interested, because apparently nothing happens in Canada. So why should we worry about it? So I think it really needs to start with, how do we stimulate the debate? And I think the only way to do that is to say, what city do we want to live in? What city do we want to leave to our children? Our voting generation has consumed our entire inheritance and the legacy we're supposed to leave to our children. We're actually a very selfish generation, hugely selfish. And I think it is time for us to ask the question and get some debate stimulated to say, what do we want to leave our children? What city do we want our children to inherit so that they can progress, be economically viable in 2050? And if we can have that vision, and it has been through a public debate, and it is informed, and people can see the consequences of, oh, we'll do more roads here. You can see that consequence. You can look it up on the internet. You can see exactly what it means. Very soon, you evolve a common understanding of what we're going towards. And that, in turn, if you think about classic decision-making and strategic management and complex systems and things like that, you're, in effect, defining your boundaries on the left and the right, and you've got your end state, your vision. So as you bounce around with local decisions, you are commonly going in the same direction. And so we're not going to solve it now. We won't solve it tomorrow or in 10 years' time. We need to be prepared to say, what is it in 30 years' time that we want to be? And with all our local issues and things like that, let's just start moving in that direction.
Thanks, Alex. So through the leadership of Quest, we're starting the debate this morning. It's now your chance to join in. Anyone with questions, I'd ask you if you can direct them to a panelist would be good. So the first hand I saw was in the back. Oh, sorry, the mic's going to control. Thanks, Eric.
Thanks very much. So when I think of urban energy systems, I think of interconnected component parts, and Alec had some slides up that showed that interrelationship between not only tangible capital assets, but also with the services that they provide and the agencies responsible for delivering them. So regardless of the lack of leadership we'd like to see at any level of government, and regardless of the infrastructure deficit and the money we'd like to see to support it, what are the agencies at the table doing to work with each other? And please answer in the light of innovation, because to me, innovation and the progressive resilience planning that we need to do can't wait till all the right ingredients are there, whether that be the right government or the right financial support. So to what degree, and including TRCA, if I may put you on the spot too, Brian, is to what degree are your different agencies already working together to do some of this proactive planning?
I can start that. I can start that. Through the City of Toronto, there is an effort being made to develop a report that they're calling the Resilient City. Actually, it's coming to committee very soon. And it does talk about interdependencies and what the gaps are and so on. So I would say that, Enbridge isn't, you aren't there directly, but you are there. You're being mentioned, but you might not be at the table. But certainly the TRCA and Toronto Hydro are there, as well as all of the departments and agencies that Alec referenced in his slide that showed the various nodes within the city, like transportation being the obvious one. So that is one effort. Clearly, we could be doing better, though.
I think that was an interesting catch. Representing Enbridge gas distribution, so a key footprint in Toronto, Niagara, and the Ottawa areas. Sometimes it feels in the energy debate and the energy planning, we kind of, electricity is the panacea out there, and a lot of focus on that. And then there's, and there's the natural gas, and we're sort of like the poor cousins that sometimes get kind of invited to move from the kids' table to the big table. So I think we need to, I say that a bit jokingly, but in all seriousness, I think that given the increasingly complex and interdependent nature of our energy systems, I think we need to all have more of a stake and a place in these kinds of discussions going forward. What I can say is where I think we do have some great collaboration is in our emergency management programs, and such as and I mentioned a couple of times, incident command systems, so that we work very closely with city agencies, including Toronto Hydro, when there is a specific event that does happen, and we do some upfront, training and emergency exercises from a business continuity side. But I think from a broader policy perspective, I think we need to, the electricity and the gas and probably district energy, all forms of energy, we need to be talking more and planning more together. So I think that's a great point.
And if I could just add, well, at least you're at the table. Sometimes it feels like we're not even in the room. But in fact, we've kind of wedged our way in. We submitted comments on to Minister Chiarelli's long-term energy plan for Ontario. We suggested that it should be an energy plan, not an electricity plan, that people are sort of moving to more distributed models, that, if you're going to look at resiliency and robust assets, that you should be recovering heat and using it. And the result was at least a couple of pages now of recognition that district energy and combined heat and power, need to be at the table. We're not at the cool kids table yet, but but we're working on it. And again, I think because Superstorm Sandy never let a good crisis go to waste. It really did heighten the visibility of Princeton University and Co-op City and NYU. And all around them, You know, when all the madness was happening, you know, at least these systems were operational. And now mayors are saying, I want what they have. And so, you know, mayors are asking us to help, and now we have to help the ministers help the mayors, and et cetera. So I think we are trying to work together, and it doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, you know, where we win and you lose. In fact, Princeton, that has 16 megawatts of generation and ice storage on their campus, their peak demand is 27 megawatts. That's how much, you know, 150 buildings needs on an August day. But when the price of power goes, you know, to the roof and the needle peak, Princeton says, okay, you know, we'll do it ourselves. Their demand on the grid now is 2 megawatts. So, you know, good for Princeton, go Tigers. But really now there's 25 megawatts in the wires that are available to that local economy. And that's a benefit that planners and utilities and, you know, we all need to sort of appreciate better. And that has to come through pricing signals and access. And most of that power is made with gas, if not all of it. And so there are some interdependencies. And I think as, you know, as we move to denser, more clustered communities, we have to have, you know, these types of assets, you know, fundamental in the infrastructure. So we're working at that. We're wedging our way into the conversation. Thanks.
And just 3 quick things, if I could, from TRCA's perspective. At the smallest scale, at our demonstration site at the Living City campus at the Courtright Center, we have in our archetype houses a little combined heat and power unit about the size of a dishwasher. And that, in combination with the solar on the roof, as long as we have a continuous supply of gas from Enbridge, we could operate off-grid indefinitely. So we try to show people that as part of the planning of their own potential actions they could take. At the next scale, Joyce and I sit on the executive environment team at the city. That's the organization that coordinates all environmental activity across the city, everything from the district energy to the kinds of resilience planning that Joyce mentioned. So there's some great stuff happening there. And then at the intra-regional scale, our latest strategic plan actually calls for us to develop some kind of intra-regional sustainability plan. We're still in the early days of trying to figure out how do we do that without offending our municipal partners who are already doing all sorts of interesting sustainability things. But it may in fact be the need for some kind of intra-regional resilience plan that's the piece of that TRCA should own as one of the few intra-regional organizations that has a governance structure that would allow us to do things on that broader scale. Next question.
Good morning, Francis Bradley with the Canadian Electricity Association. Really appreciated the comments around energy literacy and education of the public, but I wonder if you could comment, I guess particularly those that are regulated utilities, the challenge, and you put it out there, Kerry, with respect to trying to communicate that that we're not attempting to gold plate the system, but if we're going to have a more resilient system, it isn't going to be at the lowest possible cost. What about the communication challenge in terms of dealing with the regulator in these areas?
It is a challenge, and I'm thinking the best way to answer this, because I don't think we've figured out the best way to do this. Certainly, I don't think any of our regulator, the Ontario Energy Board, would ever want us to undertake undue risk. But I think there's an expectation, you're given an envelope of capital to spend, and it's usually formulaic. You know, a lot of us, I think we're all in various forms of, or various generations of incentive regulation plans where, you know, there's an expectation you have a capital envelope and you're expected to manage your risks within that. Now, there are a couple of mechanisms that allow us to, you know, bring extraneous expenditures forward. And in fact, Enbridge, we were successful in a very large, getting approval for a very large reinforcement of our GTA system, which subject to check, been a witness. I think it was about in the order of $600 million plus. So I think that was very, very welcomed, and it will go a long ways towards promoting resilience in our system. But I think that we need to be doing more of that, and we need to, I think, take the debate and start with our interveners, because I think the regulators are, there's your regulators, your board staff, interveners, but I think maybe we need to have more stakeholder consultation with them and bring them along to the informed debate as well. So I'm not sure if I completely answered your question, but it's a tough one, because at the end of the day, they still are beholden to the political side of it, where there is still keep rates as low as possible. Do more with less.
It's a challenge, for sure. And I think that, like, if you start at the basic governance for a municipal utility, I mean, I can tell you that the biggest part of my job is to deal with the municipal politics associated with Toronto Hydro. So during the ice storm, it really became very evident to me how little knowledge our Toronto elected officials actually have about the governance of a utility like Toronto Hydro. They don't have basic 101, so, and I'm assuming that they don't have basic 101, the average person doesn't have basic 101, so that's why my comments are all around, information, education, and so on. So, and people seem to think that, this is for some reason, and I really don't understand this, and I talk to all my friends about it all the time because it baffles me. It's like, we expect to pay more for everything else in society. We anticipate that we're going to have to pay more for gas, for our phones, for our food, for, driving our car. Everything has a inflationary aspect to it, except electricity and gas too. And it just confounds me. I don't understand why we have that mindset. So it comes back to the value thing, which I've already mentioned, I think. But, at the same time, we are now preparing for our next filing with the Ontario Energy Board. It's going to be a 5-year filing. And we've got some challenges. As mentioned, 30% of our infrastructure is well beyond its useful life. We need to repair that. Plus, we also need to keep in lockstep with the growth of this dynamic city. And that's a challenge. And we need to plan for that. And that takes years. At the same time, we have vulnerable people in the city. And so we have to be mindful that there are people who cannot afford to pay what the costs are now. So there's all of these pushes and pulls, and the interveners represent those pushes and pulls quite adequately. But I think that, one of the things that we've just launched is a website or a link on our website. And anybody who's interested, please come and see me after, and I'll give you my card. You can send me an email. But it's basically our little public consultation around our upcoming filing, and we're actually asking for public input into this. And this is a new approach. Generally speaking, these activities have taken place in very quiet rooms without much public input. But at the same time, there's a huge impact on people's lives and businesses if we don't get it right. So we are asking this time for consultation. I'm looking at Teresa, who represents, a lot of low-income consumers in Toronto. Like, make sure that you come and see me, and I'll give you the proper details. But so we have this big variance. But if we don't have the politics of this situation right, then we're not going to get what we want, and we're not going to be able to satisfy all of the concerns, I think, that that have been expressed today. So, we need our elected officials to understand the key importance of these kinds of activities, and to, frankly, support cost increases.
Eric, you have another question?
Thanks. Sure. Hello, my name is Wissam Shah, an MBA student of McGill University, and also a managing partner at a firm called DC Pro, which is an engineering firm specialized in district energy and CHP systems and cogeneration systems. Excuse me before I start for the slightly long question, but I just want to prepare everyone. There were a lot of challenges that were raised by all the panelists and Alex's presentation at first. And we know we are facing a lot of challenges, one of which is extreme weather events. And in approaching any challenge, the three main stages are identifying the challenge and then planning for it or designing a solution and then implementing. And of course, I come from a district energy background, so I would say, district energy and decentralized energy systems are one way, I think, excellent way of helping in all these three stages of addressing these challenges. And it helps because it simplifies each of these stages. And we can talk about, technical aspects of things and how it technically can help. But one example is in terms of what Alec mentioned of, people and the human response to a challenge or an event where you can't really get the people to where they need to be to fix the problem. If we have a decentralized energy system, and in principle, it's what Alec put out there as the grid and network of nodes. That's what a district energy system is. If we have that, then in terms of people responding to a challenge, if the system is local, then the local people, are quick to come and help fix the problem instead of waiting helplessly for a problem that's so remote and so far that they can't deal with. So in short, I think district energy is one approach to deal with what we're facing now in terms of weather and to have, better resilience in our systems, be it electricity or thermal. And my question out to everyone there is this something that would help on all the different levels? Is it something that, gets everyone here happier, in dealing with our challenges? And if it is, how do we, in terms of that last stage of dealing with a challenge of implementation, how do we get to the implementation of district energy? Maybe a specific question to Rob is, how do we get district energy out of university campuses and into communities? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. So I know George Berbari, and so I'm going to give two responses. One, when it was Superstorm Sandy, the folks at Princeton, they didn't just sort of, all go home and hope the equipment would run itself. They made plans to have people sleep in the plant. They brought in cots, they brought in food. They have emergency, preparation and plan, and they have to act on that. And, that human aspect is very important. At IDA, we've set up a program called MAID, Mutual Assistance for District Energy. So that in the event, one of our members goes down, the others are available, like you see, with the Mutual Assistance Program, electric and gas utilities. We have the same thing. So that, if a system does need to be sort of brought back to life, trained people are there, evacuating the steam lines, dealing with water hammer, et cetera. So, it does, if you're going to have these, many clusters, each of those clusters needs a few honeybees, there. To your final question, which is, so how do we actually, make these investments happen? We have a bill in the Senate now. It's called the Local Energy Sustainability and Resiliency Act. Here in Canada, you've been, I think, fortunate you've had the Green Communities Act, and FCM has really funded both, evaluation and implementation, and there have been grants available to sort of, support investment. So I think Canada is ahead of the U.S. in terms of enabling, providing capital to support investment, shared investment. Markham, Bruce Onder is here. Markham is a prime example of, where that partnership, I think, has gone to root. But in the U.S., we have to compete for private capital. They're really, I think it's Pollyanna to think that there's, a lot of funds at a municipal level to do these things. We are seeing, governors now setting aside $20 million in Connecticut, $50 million in New Jersey, $100 million in New York, focused on microgrids. So, I don't know that we're flavor of the day, but at least we're now being considered as sort of a response. But, you know, 100 million in New York is not nearly enough to deliver, you know, what the industry potential is. So, last point, one of the things that would happen, so our Microgrid Resources Coalition is intending to, you know, really talk to the regulators, because I think to this gentleman's question, the regulators really do hold the keys to the kingdom. And by enabling value for these assets, then, you know, if Princeton can get paid for VAR support or grid support and reliability, you know, that, you know, really has that value, then private capital will follow, and those funds will, you know, will then stimulate investment. So it's kind of a, you know, we're sort of in the canoe and sort of on the dock. It's kind of rocky, but we've got to start paddling as an industry much more forcefully. So it's going to be a lot of fun. How's that for an answer?
To a very leading question. Very good. Yeah, okay.
So it's Therese McClenahan, Canadian Environmental Law Association, and as Joyce mentioned, also a steering member of the Low Income Energy Network. My question is about the unanimity in terms of the need for integration, and what are the barriers around integration. And I'm interested in particular about what your views are about the way we have our regulatory system set up in Ontario, and whether there's any movement on that in the wake of the nod toward community energy planning and the long-term energy plan, because it's been my observation that we've been having these discussions, and yet because people are constrained with separate regulatory systems, for example, for gas and electricity, and for separate rate applications for each utility one at a time, that when it comes to the real world, there are a lot of barriers. And I'm just wondering if there's any movement on that, if you have any specific concrete thoughts about that, if that's something that could be broken through in the near term, as opposed to pie in the sky for 20 years down the road.
Wants to start?
Well, you've certainly identified the problem, and I can just elaborate on that a little bit. In a few years ago, I ran the low-income conservation program for Toronto Hydro, and tried to develop with the City of Toronto and Enbridge at the time a combined collaborative program that would deliver to the low-income consumer a water efficiency program, a electricity conservation program, and a gas conservation program in tandem. Oh my God, it was hell. Trying to just get everybody, well, I mean, I think there was general agreement in principle that this was a great idea and needed, but in terms of the governance of that and to get that approved, I mean, we probably spent 10 months talking about how to actually do it. And then we had very little time to actually deliver a program. And we did deliver some through through an organization called Greensaver, who was our collective delivery agent. I mean, great idea, but everybody was exhausted by the end of it, because as you mentioned, there are different regulatory regimes for the gas and the electricity sector. And they're not in tandem. They don't, the timing is different, the sort of conditions are different, and all of those things. Is there movement? Not that I'm aware of, but is it a great idea? Absolutely, and I think that we would certainly support that, knowing that in this city we have a lot of people who could benefit from such an endeavor.
Thanks, Joyce. Alec? Sorry to carry on.
It's interesting, on the two courses I teach, I used to have a question in the final exam, which was along the lines of an elderly infirm woman lives on the 24th floor of a community housing project in a interstitial community. How does she feed and warm herself during a prolonged winter power outage? And as soon as the students started writing about it, they'd started with power, and then they quickly discovered actually they're too high for the water pressure, so there's no water pressure there. Because the buses are running on LPG, they don't have compressors anymore, so the school buses are being used to provide warming shelter, therefore there's no transport. Because she's an interstitial community, she's got no access to fresh food. and the problems just compound and compound and compound. The reason for that exam question in the first place was to demonstrate that as soon as you start picking off one aspect, actually it is so dependent on so many other things that you can't treat a single aspect in isolation. But we haven't yet got to that stage within planning, municipal planning, any level of government, where we understand exactly how each department relates to the other in terms of consequence. So if a planning decision in one government department has this effect, it's been looked at almost in isolation, and the consequences of that in other departments or in the jurisdiction of other departments has not really been quite as balanced as it should have been. And one of the things that's come out to me more often than not, we're frequently asked to look at studies or conduct studies. And a lot of the studies I've reviewed, they've started off with, this is the answer, now we want a study that demonstrates it. Or the answer is electricity. So we're going to study the electricity issue to death. Or the answer is water, so we'll do that. But none of them have actually delivered an answer as a result. The studies have always been inconclusive, or they just spin their wheels. And it's that peculiar thing. It happens in every organization as well. Operations is divorced from facilities. You know, operations makes risk-based decisions. Facilities makes budget-based decisions. So what's the connection? So even within an organization, it is fractured. Never mind when you've got multiple government departments. The regulators are necessarily siloed off. So the way that they control things is in isolation. And a lot of the issues that we get is because there is no common understanding across all of them. There's no capstone legislation or no capstone approach for a government organization or a corporation to say, this is how we are going to approach this issue. And the issue, if it's an operational issue, at least then you're talking a common language for every component to say, yep, this is how we contribute to it. So I think we're trying to start too far down the chain. We need to go up to the top link and say, this is the problem. Can we now solve it?
I just wanted to add specifically to the question, or answer the question specifically. The regulators, do they treat gas, electric, and other energy systems very discreetly? And I would say yes. And maybe if you were to really step back and ask why is that? It's perhaps, or I would put forward that, you know, that's their mandate. They're typically economic regulators. And, you know, through the Public Utilities Act, and so they're very focused on that specific application. And so, for example, you know, Enbridge Gas, we're on the stand right now in our latest rate case. And with, you know, I say these comments with respect, I would say the bulk of the questions that we get are economically related as to, you know, what inflation factor did you use? What's the form of regulation, you know, in this incentive regulation? Not, you know, can you show me on your capital plan how you're reducing risk in the system? So there's nothing in the lexicon around resilience, around how are we planning for our communities. And until that mandate starts to broaden, you'll have, you know, your regulator talking about electricity one day, gas the next day, or you know, some other application. So that perhaps is something we need to look at and address.
And if I could just add, you know, this may be an early indicator and isn't all the way there, but what we're seeing, at least in the U.S., is a sort of the convergence of the energy and environmental agencies. So it used to be these were disparate sort of silos. Now they're kind of reporting to one commissioner because there's been recognition that they're very interchanged. And those commissioners are now informing the regulators. So it's progress, it's incremental, but we're starting to see at least, it's energy, environment, and economics. And so, it's it's an early stage indicator of some progress in that regard. So at least you're talking to maybe one person as opposed to, 500.
I think we have time for just one more question before we wrap up, and I see Bruce has the microphone, so.
Thanks so much. Bruce Ander with Markham District Energy, and thanks, Rob, for the Markham plugs. Well, I had the pleasure of attending the IDA Campus Conference last week, and the two major themes there, and at other conferences, is this resiliency theme and this new term microgrids. And a lot of people ask what, define microgrids, and I defined it as sort of locally sited, reliant, self-reliant energy systems, electrically and thermally and so on. Much of the generation that's been added in the province over the last 5 years as a result of the Green Energy Act, for example, has been wind and solar. And now in the current long-term energy plan, the electricity supply, plan in front of the province, it's funny that resiliency and microgrids really, as much as those are the main themes as I'm hearing in the discussion, are almost absent in that planning and those documents. Solar and wind, and whether a gas plant's located in Sarnia or elsewhere, for Markham, has no resiliency impact at all if I lose power through the distribution grid to Markham. So my concern is, and this will lead to a question for Joyce and a different question for Alec, is my concern is how vulnerable the City of Toronto is to severe weather, acts of terror, as much as we don't want to think about that, or just infrastructure failure. For a city of 2 million, or if you look at the GTA, a population of 5 million, other than a few minor examples, we have essentially no embedded local generation at all. And so, and that could be, the first thing we think of is natural gas combined heat and power, natural gas plants. But if you look to Europe, that could be power generation and thermal generation from waste, energy from waste, or biomass or other fuels, biogas. Natural gas is our first thought right now, but so my question to Joyce is, does anybody, I know there are some people, you included, does anybody in the City of Toronto really get how vulnerable, how many near misses Toronto's had in the last few years of major citywide outages that could last for some time? And I guess my question, Alec, you talk about, the research of this. There must be ways of looking at the macroeconomic impact of that worst case scenario. Because when you look at the electricity supply debate in Ontario, it's very, very analysis, if you like, in that this supply option is cheaper than that supply option, or this supply option has a slightly better environmental footprint than that supply option. And that's almost the extent of it, where if you look at the economic analysis of widespread energy interruption in Toronto, the dollars are obviously, it's a different analysis, which would lead you to say, so what's the benefit of the insurance policy of having a lot of local generation against that possible circumstance?
Well, okay. Thanks, Bruce. Well, let me first say that Toronto Hydro is very supportive of embedded generation and, in fact, is an investor in solar with the City of Toronto, a number of projects that we've already got in place, excuse me, that have received FIT contracts, and a bunch of others that are in the queue for FIT contracts. So we believe in that, and we also believe in facilitating district energy systems and other forms of, if you want to call it newer type technologies, but I think more in the renewable area, simply because we also feel like we have an environmental responsibility and we can't be adding to the air pollution load within the city. So I think that's one thing. is the city aware how vulnerable we are? I think yes, and I think particularly after both the July storm and the ice storm, the answer is absolutely yes. That's why this report around the resilient city is going forward to committee and council, and also why Toronto Hydro was kind of on the hot seat for 2 days at a special council meeting about like what happened and why did all of these things occur in terms of the ice storm and the restoration efforts, and why don't we have undergrounding, and why aren't you in the 311 system, and all of these kinds of things. So that the answers are, and the summary from that is going to a July council meeting. So there is absolutely acknowledgement within the city that we are vulnerable. Now, having said all that, in our last rate application, we went around to particularly the business community, the Toronto Board of Trade, BOMA, and other organizations to say, could you guys please support our application to the OEB that is going to see more dollars invested in capital upgrades and so on? And we had very little support, frankly. Like, we had lots of support in one-on-one conversations, but we had very little actual support when it came to, the process, the formal process that the OEB undertakes. So it's kind of confounding to us that we know that this is a huge issue, and to have the city come down for as long as it did during, granted, thank God in some ways it was during the Christmas break, although that affected me personally because I didn't get a vacation, but whatever. Trying to make light of it. But the point is that it would have a massive impact had it been at another time, or had it lasted for longer, or had more of the city gone down. Like, personally, I didn't lose electricity at home, so I was very, very fortunate. So I think it depended on where you are in the city and what system you're actually connected to. But all of this stuff doesn't mean anything to the average person. So again, we have to keep pumping out the information and the, even maybe a little more scare tactics to people so that they start paying a little more attention. But, as far as the city is concerned, they are aware of this, and I think for the first time, we'll actually have a cooperative intervention by the city at the OEB. So it's very good.
As a supplemental, I think I should say that there still is a perception through specific project examples that Toronto Hydro does continue to put up barriers, technical and rate barriers against combined heat and power being implemented within the city boundary. So, Toronto Hydro is a big animal, but I would want you to be, want to be clear that there's still a perception that Toronto Hydro is not in favor of locally sited generation of any scale.
Well, we should talk about that. And if you've got specifics, I'd like to know about, because that is not our general policy.
That's good to know.
Okay.
And I think part of the question was, Alec?
To the second half of that question. Resilience planning, if it's going to be done correctly, is a balance between demand and dependency management. You can't do one in isolation. The community housing in Austria, I can't remember which city, but Linz. Community housing in Austria, they said, well, if somebody needs community housing because they can't afford the rent, chances are they can't afford to heat the place either. So consequently, community housing will build them passive house standards, so that when we have a power outage, and it gets down to minus 36 in the Austrian Alps, when we have a power outage, they will still survive, and it's not an issue. And also, they will not be a burden on us as a city because of high energy demand. Here, we divorce those issues. We don't look at it together. When we look at public transportation, all the arguments and debates are about mode of transport. It's not about whether we are going to have abundant access. It's not about whether we're going to have equity of demand. It's always about the mode of transport. So you can try and get from one side of the city to another. And even if you're going in a straight line, east-west, you still have to use 4 different modes of transport to get from one end of the city to another. We always seem to focus our debate too far down in the weeds. These are implementation issues. These are actually design issues. They're not requirement issues. The city needs to talk about requirements. Once you've got your requirements fixed, you can then design to it. Let people get on with that. Don't debate, whether you're going to have a marble countertop. How about working out whether you're actually going to have a house to put the marble countertop into? It's a rather more fundamental question. And unless our discussion is about demand and dependency together, you will never be able to approach a macroeconomic argument. When you do have that macroeconomic argument, the picture changes dramatically. And you start looking at the logistic burden. That is, the resources that you need for day-to-day operation are being allocated to safeguard supplies. It's just ludicrous if you look at the wastage of resources because we're not trying to balance demand with dependency. We're just trying to answer one or the other. And it's one of the problems that has come about through this debate on adaptation. By looking at adaptation in isolation, in many ways, is actually producing solutions that take you away from resilience, even though adaptation is a cornerstone of resilience.
Thank you, everyone, for your attention and participation. Back to you, Brent, for the wrap-up.
Well, first, let me just, please join me just thanking again the panel. I think they were fantastic. Alec, Kelly, Brian, Joyce, and Rob, I think, did a great job trying to summarize what is if you think about it, a bit of a daunting concept, let alone in terms of how we're going to apply that in terms of our daily activities and work. But I also want to just take a few minutes and thank a few people who helped pull this together. Sean Conway, who had to leave, I just want to thank Ryerson University and particularly Center for Urban Energy, Sarah, who was also, I think, had to leave, for their help allowing us to put this event together here at Ryerson. So just join me in thanking them. I also want to thank our sponsor for today's Quest Talks, the Canadian Gas Association, represented by Kelly, who's here today as well. So thank you very much. Again, thank you very much. Or just take a moment to thank them too. Carrie, pardon me, Carrie. Thank you, Carrie. Just want to summarize what I picked up on through our conversation today a little bit. Well, there's 4 things that I picked up on. 1, there's a lot of planning left to be done. And we talked about the need to continue to integrate that planning, both at the municipal level, the provincial level, and a role for the federal government. In the Ontario context, for those who may not be familiar, yesterday the province announced a new provincial policy statement. That's for, in the coming, about 5 years now. And in that, they open up with a new statement right at the beginning on the importance of healthy communities, which is a change very much so in the direction of the provincial policy statement. They go on and they use the term resilient and resiliency in that beginning paragraph of the entire document. The document also says shall. So over the next 5 years, every municipality in Ontario shall be giving much more thought to how they will be planning for healthy communities, including the aspect and the importance of resiliency. So just a little interest there about maybe that role for planning. Education was the other key concept I think we came back to on a regular basis. Not just the public, but the practitioner. I think we hold both. There's quite a difference going on here, even amongst our panelists, in terms of their own understanding and knowledge about what needs to be done. With that, there's also an important aspect here growing in Ontario that's being jointly led by a number of organizations to create an energy community of practice. And I just want to recognize 3 different organizations, 4 right now going on. Quest, as well as the Canadian Urban Institute, Clean Air Partnership, and OSEA are all actively starting to better and move forward on a discussion about how to create a community energy of practice in terms of here in Ontario to help keep this conversation going. So please feel free to talk to 2 people. I just want to point out 2. In the back, over here, Bernie McIntyre, who's with the Toronto Regional Conservation Authority. He also serves as the chair for the Ontario Caucus. and Samira Drapos, the caucus coordinator. She's at the back, and they'd be happy to talk to you a bit more about the work of the caucus. The third item picked on was market signals. We heard a lot about the importance of trying to send better messages, not just to the consumer, but also understanding of the economic regulator and their role. But that also has to start with a policy decision maker. So how we pull those all together is going to be quite the important discussion. Last but not least, it was coordination, collaboration, and integration. Common themes that I've heard among all the associations who are involved in this discussion going forward. And it also pulls us back to why we had Brian here on behalf of the TRCA help us moderate this discussion. TRCA, from my perspective, fundamentally was born out of a response to a catastrophic situation in the Toronto region, flooding. And that came after a very significant hurricane, a number of deaths, and the response was, how do we start to plan for what might be 1 in 100-year cycles of large-scale extreme weather events? Very much what was exposed and seen in Calgary. They've done a phenomenal job of starting to think about regional water planning, but they've also been very carefully starting to link that to energy and the importance and response of regional planning for that and governments going forward. So I think there's a direct linkage here about coordination. Who's going to do this? Who's going to help us start to pull these conversations together more readily? It's something that Brian hinted at during discussions. It's something that we're going to hopefully to carry on with going forward, I think is quite important. So just again, a few quick reminders for things coming up. That conversation is continuing with the resilient pipes and wires. Richard's here for the next half hour to feel free to discuss with him. We'll carry it on at Quest 2014 in Vancouver. But we'll also be back here, all going well, in the fall for our next Quest Talks, where I think we'll have a different topic but a very similar theme, and I would welcome all of you at that time. So please, a round of applause for all your participation. It was greatly appreciated, and thank you again for this morning for your attendance. And that will conclude us. This room is available right now.